Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, heritage professionals, and others about history, games, and the places where they meet. I'm your host and moderator, Eduard Gafton, and in this episode, I am very much pleased to be joined by Tomislav Čipčić. Tom is a game designer and computer programmer from Croatia. Born in Šibenik, Tom spent a big part of his childhood enduring the chaotic war years. This experience led to him becoming a passionate student of modern history, especially military history. Moving to Split after the war, Tom has been designing games for much of his life since. With the game for this episode, Brotherhood and Unity, his board game about the war and Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992-1995, he aimed to capture the essence of that defining historical event and to bring it to the wargaming table. Tom, thank you so much for being on. How are you doing today?
Thank you for inviting me. I am doing quite well. It's very hot today, so I'm sweating a bit. I hope it doesn't show.
No worries, you look perfectly fine. For listeners
Great.
unfamiliar with Tom's game, Brotherhood and Unity is, and I'm quoting here from the website, a 2 to 3 player card driven war game which shows all of the major events of the Bosnian War, from the siege of Sarajevo, shown in a separate detailed map, to the ferocious battles for the Posavina corridor. The game simulates 3 distinct sides in the war: Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, with military strength fluctuating based on historical facts, meaning that the Serbs, for example, have a much better starting position than the Bosniaks are struggling to organize an effective fighting position. Also interesting is that there is no clear border separating these 3 distinct sides, meaning that players may very well form pragmatic alliances with former enemies, as was historically the case. Tom, you've mentioned growing up, and I have here like the fact that you grew up during the time of the Bosnian War. How is that like for you? As a broad opening question, what do you remember from the Bosnian War? What do you remember from your childhood?
Well, one of my best friends was from Sarajevo, and another best friend was from Banja Luka. So I know from their personal accounts that situation was very, very dark indeed. I mean, there was a war in Croatia as well at that time, but it was a bit different for us because most of the military operations were over by the end of 1991, and from 1992 to 1995 in Croatia, at least in Šibenik, we had sporadic shelling, like terrorist shelling attacks and stuff like that. But in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was a constant warfare. And I heard about stories from siege of Sarajevo, how he ran from the town at one point using a tunnel and got away from the fighting, and how he was engaged in the fighting when he was 16. He was 16, having rifle, defending the city from the outskirts of the city, and then his father came and took him out of the city. It was very strange to hear something like that, especially in the 1990s, when we thought that war was more or less over forever. You know.
Yeah.
How was it for you?
Oh, for me, I
You
wasn't. Yeah, I wasn't necessarily born. I'm born.
Are you younger?
Yeah, I'm much younger than that. I'm 1997. So for me,
Oh,
again, for listeners, I am Romanian. So for me, I hear stories of '89. I hear stories of the bloody revolution that happened in Romania, but nothing beyond that. My father was on military service during the actual like revolution, and then he had a similar story of like being extremely young and having to defend a military base from the people, which is a different, obviously much different situation. But yeah, I think we both happen to come from countries where war is not such distant of a memory as it is anywhere and everywhere else, maybe. I want to ask you about Brotherhood and Unity in particular. Was it a lifelong project? Did you always mean to make a game about the Bosnian War? Was it always in your mind?
no, it came accidentally, actually, because I always wanted to make a game about World War II in North Africa, about Rommel and Montgomery, and that's what I'm doing now. But it came when I read a book, a great book by a Croatian author, Davor Marian, and book was about we call it Homeland War, that is a war in Croatia, and it's a big, large book like this, big one, and in it, while reading it, as people do, I saw a material to make a game, and I said, why wouldn't I make a game out of this? Because I was already doing some games for myself and for my group of friends, and at that moment I didn't publish any game yet, but I created several games before it. And I said, why wouldn't I make a game about war in Croatia? And I started to do that. I made a map, made units, defined the core mechanics, and realized slowly that I couldn't make a grand strategy game of war in Croatia, because war in Croatia was split between 1991
Mm-hmm.
and several shorter engagements which happened here and there in the next 4 years. So, but what I realized that I could do similar game for the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was connected to the war in Croatia. And then I started tinkering with the idea of making that game, and little by little it became the game we have now.
Oh, wonderful. And yeah, before we go on to ask you more questions, I want to mention to the listeners and viewers that like everything that Tom will mention in terms of like books, in terms of games, will be linked in the descriptions. I suspect this will be a link heavy episode. So for more information on Tom's video game about, you know, a campaign in North Africa, Attack at Dawn, there's a link to the website for the game, and also the Homeland War book. I'll ask you after the recording for you to send me the actual link, so that people who listen in and watch the podcast might enjoy the resources aspect of this podcast as well. So it wasn't always a game about the Bosnian War. Like you mentioned, like you wanted to just like make a game first of all. How then in the process of like making Brotherhood and Unity did you land on it being a card-driven war game? I'm personally not familiar with this particular subgenre of like war games. Could you tell us more about the history of this style of game and how you came to innovate on it with your game, with Brotherhood and Unity?
Well, it's one of my favorite gaming mechanics, card-driven game. And there is a couple of great lectures on that topic, one by Volko Ruhnke, who is one of the best designers using this game system, and the other one I think is by Brian Train, who also used it many times in a very, very successful way. But to say it shortly, card-driven game system is a system where each and every action of the game is done by playing a card. And each card can be used in several different ways. Cards usually have a value, and that value gives you certain amount of actions you can do. And actions can be anything from a movement, attack, entrenchment, I don't know, redeployment, reinforcement, whatever. And cards usually also have so-called event. And event is a historical event described in a couple of sentences, and it's on a card. There is usually a nice image, nice picture. You can even show it if you have some examples here. So when you play a card, you need to decide. You have a deck of cards and you have several of them in your hand, and as if you are playing a poker game, you need to decide which of these cards am I going to play. Am I going to play this card, which gives me this value and maybe this ability, this event, or this one? And that card play really gives an edge. Psychologically, it's fun for a human to play a card and for him to decide between this choice and this choice, which one is the better choice now. That's the good thing about card-driven games. They give you a set of choices. They give you randomness, because you don't have to use all of the cards in the deck for one game session. So if you use only a half of the deck, next time you will have another set of cards and maybe the game will go differently. And the third thing is that you can really put your history into these cards. For instance, if you have Sarajevo Sniper Rally, that can be one card. If you have, I don't know, shelling of Bihać, or maybe the fall of Srebrenica, you can put it in a card and give it in the game model several different actions that happen as a result of this event. So that's the beauty of card-driven games. And I can't be sure which game was the first one, but I think it was in the 1980s that they first started employing them. But probably the biggest popularizer of this genre was Mark Herman, one of my favorite designers and one of the best wargame designers at this moment, who with his designs like For the People, We the People, with the American Revolution and American Civil War, really got this system to the next level, for instance.
Yeah, interesting. How is Brotherhood Unity different from that? Like, what does it do different? How does it push the subgenre forward?
Well, first of all, when you design a game, you don't start from scratch regarding the game mechanics. You actually have a toolbox of existing game mechanics from all the other games that are out there, and you pick and choose core mechanics which will you use in your game. So you're not stealing from everybody. We are just borrowing from each other, and that's been happening for a century now. So what I did and what I do when I make each and every new game, I first of all decide on the core principles. How many players, how long will the game last, what will the subject be, and what type of game will it be? Will it be military, political, diplomatical, grand strategy, or tactical level? And when I decide on the core goals of the design, then I decide on the mechanics, and then I have my toolbox with all the other games I played and with all the other mechanics I know from card-driven games, hex and counter, from zone control, area control, everything. And then I try and see every of these mechanics, how do they fit my design goal. And I decided early on that this will be a grand strategy game, a 3-player game, and I wanted it to be playable in one sitting, and that's usually 3-4 hours maximum, because when you get around the table with a group of people, especially with 2 other people, and when you finally get together, you have 3-4 hours maximum, 5 at best times to play a game. And I didn't want this game to be saved for later, because that would reduce the playability. So I wanted it to be short enough. And when I saw the systems like Paths of Glory, which is a great game, which uses point-to-point movement between certain strategic locations on the map in combination with card-driven design, that was my starting point. And then slowly but surely I saw how I could streamline those mechanics, reduce the amount of administrative work in order to speed up the gameplay. Because originally these kinds of games have separate phases for movement. First of all, you move, and then you attack. And then I wanted to, for instance, remove that to speed it up. And I had to tweak the rules in order to keep the gameplay at the same level, but to be a little bit faster. And I reduced the playing time by eliminating those phases. Or for instance, games usually have unit names, unit designations. Each and every unit counter has certain set of combat factors and the name, for instance, 1st Guards Brigade, 2nd Guards Brigade. But when you look at it, if you really want to have those unit names, you need to increase your setup time for like 20 minutes. Because when you have 3 people, placing each and every of those 20-30 counters on exact spot on the board, it takes 15-20 minutes per game to do that. And that's a lot of time. And then I said, I will not have unit names. Some of people don't like it, but my argument is that makes game faster. And on the other hand, most of those combat factors are the same. I have separate elite units and separate standard units, which have different combat factors and are easily recognizable, but you don't have to spend time trying to find where each and every one of those goes. And things like that. And I really try to optimize the gameplay speed and use those existing systems as much as possible. And for instance, combat calculation. In these types of games, combat is calculated so that you take all the attacking units and take all the defensive units and make a sum of all the combat factors of the attackers and divide it by the sum of the defense factors of the defending units. And then you get a ratio. And then you take a table, and then you find the column for that ratio, and then you roll a die. I mean, it takes time. And you need to have that combat table. Each player needs to have his own combat table, his or hers, in the lab, and to look at it and see, and to calculate the odds. And then I said, why would I want that? And I saw the system that, for instance, Mark Herman uses in Empire of the Sun, which is a beautiful game. One of the best war games ever. And he uses a very simple but very effective system where you just roll a die and then you get a multiplier. You get ×2, ×half, or maybe ×1.5. And what you do, you take your attacking units sum, for instance, 20, and then you multiply it by 2 or by half or by 1.5. Everybody can do that very, very fast, very easily. And that's your strength. And it tells you practically that your unit at that particular battle fought as twice as hard as it usually does, or as half as hard as it usually does. It gives you that luck factor that you need, and you don't need a table because you can remember very, very soon that if you roll from 3 to 6, 3 to 6, you get the ×1. If you roll 0, you get divided by 4. If you roll 1 or 2, it's divided by 2, and that's it. And you remember it, and you speed up the gameplay.
Yeah, interesting. I'm thinking a lot about like what you said about like design goals, and I'm thinking about like your design philosophy. So you started from having like a few key elements or like key goals, like wanting to make the game more playable, wanting it to be fast, wanting it to be played in one sitting. Did the team come first? Did you covering the Bosnian War come first, and then you adapted the team to a game, or did you have like design philosophies in place or like game mechanics, and then you were like, oh, actually, why don't I just make it about the Bosnian War? Like, because you said you've decided pretty early on that it was going to be a 3-player game, and to me that fits perfectly on the Bosnian War. So like, which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of question?
Yeah, first came the topic. This is what happened with this game. I mean, each game is a story for itself. For this game, first of all, topic got me interested, which usually does because I read a lot of books, a ton of books constantly. And when I really find some topic that interests me, when I get an idea, I write down that idea. And when I get some free time in the future, I go back to that idea, and starting from that idea and that topic, I start building the game. That's the principle I use.
Oh, interesting.
Some other designers use a different principle. I even myself, when I started, I experimented with some systems and said, oh, this is an interesting system, like impulse-driven area control you have in Mike Rinella's games, for instance. And I said, well, why wouldn't I make some game that goes like that? Fast, impulse-driven tactical game. You can go starting from mechanics, but in this instance, I started from the topic of the game.
Interesting. And then obviously, since we are, this is the History and Games Lab, and this is the History and Games Lab podcast, the question we ask every single guest on the podcast is, should games be historically accurate? How historically accurate is Brotherhood and Unity, especially because you started from the topic? Like, what was the most challenging part of like making a game that has all of the elements that you wanted it to be playable, replayable, to be finished in one sitting, to have 3 players? What is the compromise in between like telling history as it happened and having a game that is fun and has all of your design goals in mind?
What is historical accuracy? That is an even better question, because especially in game design, I mean, we are making a game models in which you are trying to recreate history, but also have fun. So if was a professional thing, then it would be less fun and more accurate, and that would be called simulation. But the problem with accuracy is you can't really be sure if your game is as accurate as could be, because you only know one outcome, historical outcome. So what you try to do is, by guessing and by educated guessing, to make a game model that recreates, that one of the outcomes of your game recreates the historical outcome. But that's not necessarily the most often outcome of the game. You try to find that balance, and you can't really learn that. It comes from within you, from all of your experiences, from reading the histories, to decide for yourself what for you is historically accurate. For instance, in this particular game, was it given that Serbs start so aggressively and take so much area at the beginning? Was it natural for Croats and Bosniaks to go into alliance later on in 1994 or not? Was it maybe possible for the Bosniaks and Serbs to go into alliance? And you see all those things that happened and could have happened, and the historians which research those alternate histories and try to encompass them all in the game. So historical accuracy is something we strive for, but we can't reach it, and also we can't be sure that we are close to it. And many of the discussions on the especially Facebook group like Wargamers, which is the biggest group, Wargamers group, on the, as far as I know, and on 𝐶 World, people are often discussing of if some element of the game is historically accurate, because it's controversial topic. You never can be quite sure what is accurate and what isn't.
And especially with the Bosnian War, as far as I remember it, and as far as I know, it is a bit controversial, especially if you play with players from the regions. Like, did you have any comments? You can kind of anticipate the question. Did you have any comments from people in the region about, like, hey, this is not really how it happened. This is this and this is that. Like, what was player reaction, especially players who, like, you know, like your friends have lived these moments? Like, what did they say about it?
Well, in this part of the world, I think pretty much everything is controversial. I mean, even from the selection of favorite foods and to football or something. Well, most of the people who heard about the game from my neighborhood were confused. They haven't seen games like this before. Many people here still are not into wargaming. Board gaming is very much has very much spread, and there are many conventions and cafes who give you the possibility to play mostly Euro style board games. But wargaming, which is much heavier, much deeper, takes much more commitment, is very, very narrow and confined. And when people heard about it, some of them were offended. How can he dare to make a game about such a serious subject? And then I had to defend the idea, because especially for people from Bosnia and Herzegovina, I told them that, well, we had many movies. We had one even was awarded an Oscar, No Man's Land, for instance, and 𝐂 𝐤𝐴𝐷𝐼 was nominated for Oscar this year. So if you can have films, if you can have books, if you can have TV shows talking about it, why couldn't we have a serious historical war game? Especially because the war game puts you in the place of one of the players, which is, for me, the most rewarding part of making a game. Because when you watch a film, you are just a spectator. You can see one point of view of the writer, of the director, that's it. But when you play a game, you get to see it from making decisions. Which decisions would you make? And would you be as aggressive, as brutal, or not? And that, for some people, is more than they can bear. But I think as the time goes, we will spread the awareness of the necessity of gaming, especially those hardcore gaming, and people will understand the beauty of it.
Yeah, interesting. I have a question here that I kind of want to put in here because it is now relevant. Like, are there many games which cover the Bosnian War, like even video games, board games, or otherwise? Because I think if you're not used to games in general, or like especially historical games of any nature, I think it comes as a shock, right? Like, again, most people, I think, especially in the region, especially in my region as well, have an idea of like, oh, games is being reductive, games being primarily for children, and I think this is a perception problem, right?
Yes.
Yeah, what about other games that have tried or, to successfully or perhaps unsuccessfully cover the Bosnian War? Do you have any other that you know of? Or is Brotherhood and Unity the first one?
There were several games, but one of them was what could have happened if the war continued. The other one was that was from Ty Bomba. The other one was Javier Romero, about primarily 1991 in Croatia and Slovenia. But the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina on a strategic level, this is the first game of that type, as far as I know. Maybe there was some magazine game, but I think not. I would have heard about it by now. So this is the first one that covered the entire war and the war itself, for that matter. And that's why it was especially important to do it right. Not to be presumptuous, not to be choosing sides, trying to be objective, trying to have respect for the casualties on all three sides. Yeah, the first one.
Interesting. And you said now about like not choosing sides. How is it for you to play the game? Again, this game is a game for three people. It's very much separated. Like even the dice and the die have separate colors. It's very much a these are the Bosniaks, these are the Serbs, these are the Croats. How is it for you to play the game? How is it for you to choose different sides? Do you have a reaction to being put in like different shoes?
No, I have no emotional reaction whatsoever, depending on the side I play. I have emotional reaction if I play good or bad, because I'm the designer. So I look at the game from the mechanics point of view. What does this mechanic do? Does it achieve what I wanted it to achieve? Does it represent the historical event or not? I am sensible in how to portray, for instance, one very important aspect of this war was the question of refugees, because since this was a citizen war, there was a break of ruling structure in Bosnia and Herzegovina from the start, because this wasn't like one very firm and defined country getting into the war. This was many things at the same time. This was a breakup of the country from within, an implosion of sorts. So you had anarchy. You didn't have a defined front line. And one of the key aspects of the war was taking all the civilians from the city and just sending them away into buses, and off you go to your side. Ethnic cleansing was first and foremost characteristics, because the idea was to produce ethnically clean state. And how can I portray this in the game? It was very tricky, and that's when I decided to abstract it into what is now known as foreign attitude in this game. A mechanic in which, when you capture a city, you cause a diplomatic stress, a diplomatic turmoil internationally, especially in the UN, and that reduces your reputation, so to speak. And I don't show the refugees. I don't talk to you where these people go, but behind that mechanic, you know that there are 100,000 poor people who were fled from their cities to another city, and that was shown on the media all over the world, on the CNN or NBC or whatever, and that's what reduced your reputation. And that's, for instance, one example of how when you create a mechanic, you need to have that mechanic, but you need to do it in such a way that you don't hurt feelings. I didn't want to show refugee counters on the map, which you can then move. That would be too much, I think. But you need to abstract it somehow with some kind of mechanic of the game, which if you take too much cities in short period of time, then you get sanctions. And if you go too far, NATO comes in to bomb you with airstrikes. And that's one example how to do it and not go too far with explicitly showing what needs to be shown. If you look at the films like La Vita è Bella,
I was thinking absolutely that, yeah.
So you can show the horror, but you don't need to show it directly. And it's even worse if you leave it unsaid and unshown and just as a touch of information for you to research for yourself later on.
And speaking of research, and this is a fascinating aspect of the game for me, it comes together with a significantly large bibliography. Like I know you've packaged, a selection of books that players should read. How important is it to you that players understand the historical context before and or after playing it? Should people jump like myself jump into Brotherhood Unity with like understanding the historical context, or are you also open to the idea of like most people not doing the homework, as it were?
Well, it depends on the player. I frankly do not care how the people will approach the game. If they like the game and they find something in the game, that's good enough for me, because we all have our own ways and our own free times. For instance, when I play a game, I usually just go and play it, learn about the rules, how to move, how to attack, how to defend, stuff like that, and play. And if the game is interesting enough, then I began researching and reading from the bibliography, and then researching more and more if the game really draws me in. It's same with the films, for instance. If you watch the film about the thing you didn't know anything about, and if the film is interesting enough, then you start your research and maybe watch some other films on the topic. So whatever the players choose, that's good enough for me.
Yeah. So the game is a gateway into like players finding more information.
Could be, yeah.
Interesting.
And was in many times it was.
We mentioned a lot about like alternative histories and alternative scenarios. Brotherhood and Unity has a special scenario, or like a special variant called Fight to the End, where the game doesn't end on the fourth turn as is usual. Instead, the game is played until one of the players surrender or is defeated. What are the alternative history or what if scenarios that have emerged or would emerge from this way of playing, and how do they change our way of thinking of about the Bosnian War? Like, are there any alternative histories that you're like, oh, this is interesting? Like, what can you gather from different ways that differ from the historical, accurate, canonical thing that actually happened?
Well, alternate histories are always good to explore and to see. For instance, as you said, Fight to the End is one example of what could have happened if the United Nations and the international community didn't stop the war, because they did do that. They did force the warring sides, the belligerents, to go to Dayton and to stop it. They had their reasons why they wanted to do it, and that's why we have the situation we have now. But what if they didn't? Then you could have used this game model to see if the Croats entered Banja Luka, or Bosniaks entered Banja Luka, or maybe Croats attacked Bosniaks. What could have happened? And that gives you a nice gateway to the possible conflicts in the future, because if the situation is not yet resolved, because if there are still tensions, what can happen in the decades to come? And you can experiment using this game model to see, well, militarily, what could be the next moves if this conflict occurs again. That's one of the ways of looking at these alternative ways. As I told you, I think Ty Bomba did a game in 1995, 1996. What could have happened if back then NATO didn't come in? And Croats starting moving to Banja Luka and to Republika Srpska and stuff like that. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, absolutely.
Feel free to elaborate.
I'm also processing it. It's a heavy subject as well. I'm thinking things through. Obviously, this is a game that which is ideal for 3 people, but you also made it that it is possible for only 2 people to play it. Does that change the game in any fundamental way, or does it change how we think about the conflict, about the war?
Yes, it does. I had to have 2-player version of the game because that's how most of the war games are played, as 2-player games. And this was one variant, one alternate history in which Croats and Bosniaks were allied from the beginning to the end, which wasn't the case. Because if it was the case, Serbs wouldn't have won. I wouldn't say wouldn't have won, but they had no chance of winning. Because you have 60% of the population against 30% of the population. It's pure mathematics. It's very hard to do that on that very long front line. You need to do something else. And that's one thing I chose as a variant, because that was one thing that could have happened. But then I had a problem of balancing the game, because it's very hard to fight if they are twice as strong as you. And that's why you have such a disbalance from early war in the game, when Serbs are overwhelmingly powerful, and the late war, when the Serbs are not as powerful, and the Bosniaks have really started to create many brigades. And then the very experienced player needs to play either very fast at the beginning and then very defensively at the end. For me, it's not as fun and as not as accurate, here's that word again, historical accuracy, is not as accurate as 3-player game, because it's completely different dynamics. Completely different dynamics. In a 2-player game, there's just a plain tug of war, pure balance. If somebody wins, the other one loses. And that's it. Just push and pull, push and pull. And when the rock starts rolling downhill, it's very hard to stop it, you know. And then you need to add some other mechanics to prevent the player who is overwhelmingly powerful to destroy the other one instantly. And you need to have some kind of leverage. And in a 3-player game, the game leverages itself. If you have 3 players playing to the best of their ability, and if they know how to play, the game balances itself. It's much more in the middle of that.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm thinking again from the description, pragmatic alliances don't happen organically in 2 players, because you obviously don't have anyone to form an alliance with. And I think the addition of the 3rd player really changes things up and really makes it more like tactically challenging and interesting. I wanna move the conversation to tabletop simulator, and also the actual context of pandemic context. Many players have gone to use tabletop simulator to play Brotherhood and Unity online with with their friends. How did you find that transition from players gathering around the board to now making a mod and playing it online? Now I know from reading the description of the mod that they've required permission from the publisher to make it into a mod. But how do you feel about people playing board games, war games, any games now in a more digital world via tabletop or Tabletopia or any of these services?
I think it's great. It's first of all practical. It allowed us to play even though we are all confined to our homes. And it's practical because you set up the game instantly. You can save it. You can load it later on and do things like that. The missing thing is being close to somebody, to a friend, and taunting him or her and saying, you're gonna lose, and seeing that dice rolling. That's the thing you are missing. You are missing that tactile feeling of touching the counters and touching the board and having the cards in your hand. That's what's missing. But the idea of being able to use digital technology to do all this is fascinating. And I'm thinking of a very, very not future world, very near future, when we will have tables like big tablets, big touch tables in every cafe, and you will be able to play these games everywhere you go. I dream of that day, really, going to a cafe with a friend and playing a board game. And I can save it, I can load it, I can put it on the clouds, or I can finish it at home or anywhere else. And I think we are going into some kind of a mixed future when we will mix these cardboard counters and rules with the digital technology to give us the better experience, to reduce that administration, reduce the setup time, to enable us to save the game and reload the game, and then also to have that counters and maps. Something will be, I think, invented very soon to be able to use that, and I like it.
I hope so as well. That sounds fascinating. This hybridization of the board game experience, of the game experience, is very much welcome by me. With your game, you have a new project, Attack at Dawn North Africa. That is a video game that is available for people to wishlist on Steam. How was the transition from physical war game to making a video game, and how has the medium changed how you think about games, if it has in any way?
Well, it's a different beast altogether, making a computer war game. It's, first of all, much more technically challenging. Much more time is used for things you don't use when you design a tabletop war game. If you want to change a rule in a tabletop war game, you just cross a word and write another sentence, and that's it, and you are off to go. You can play test it. If you want to do it on a computer, you need to make a program. You need to code in C# or C++, and then you test it. And then if you have a bug, you need to recompile and stuff like that. It takes, I think, for me, 8 to 10 times more time to produce the same thing. And the game you are making cannot be the copy of a tabletop war game, because people wouldn't accept it. If you make a tabletop war game like my game or any other game, that game is played usually in 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. It can have several scenarios, and that's it. And when you look at the price tag on the internet, it starts from $50 to $100 plus shipping. And if you look at the games on Steam for PC, which cost $50, $60, those are the AAA games. Yeah. Those are the best games. Hundreds of people have worked there. You know, these games, tabletop games, are sold in a couple of thousand copies. And these computer war games or computer first-person shooters for $60 are sold in millions of copies. That's completely different. And people wouldn't accept you to port a board game into a computer world and to charge it the same. And it takes you 10 times more time to develop it and to do it. It's incredible that disparity between these two worlds. But what I did, I used the mechanics that I found in the tabletop world and translated it into the computer world. For instance, I wanted to have an operational level game in which you move the tanks, not tanks, but regiments, battalions. You see those tanks rolling on the desert. But on the other hand, to get that historical feel, that historical accuracy, I use the historical values for attack, for defense, for movement, for each and every unit, and the historical names and the orders of battle. And I wanted to combine that hex and counter feel of a war game and a top-down view with a computer game. Because, for instance, many computer games that do the similar thing, they present you with the 3D view. Your camera is
Isometric.
at an angle, yeah, isometric view, and that view isn't giving you the overview you need. Because what I love about tabletop war games, you can stand on your 2 feet and watch at your table, your map from the top, and you see everything at one glance. And when you do these games, you can't see it because you have used those 3D models to make your game look prettier, but you have lost the overview of the situation. So what you practically do, you move your little tanks up and down, but you are not thinking strategically. And when I turn my camera to see from top to directly downwards, then I got the necessary effect. And that's one mechanic I took from the tabletop. Top-down view, zoom in, zoom out, unit counters, hexes, zones of control, all those mechanics, and combine them with real-time, synchronous, turn-based movements to create what I'm creating now.
And obviously real time is not really possible, and at least not in the same way in wargaming, right? So I think that is a big difference.
And that gives you, that's one interesting thing. Turn-based is a way of, I wouldn't call it turn-based, I would call it sequential.
Sequential,
in which, in which one player does something and then the other player does something. And that is the core aspect of tabletop, because doing it simultaneously produces many problems. Games have tried it, but it very soon becomes very tough to do, especially in a complex game. So what you did is reduced your number of moving units to 1 or 2 or maybe 1 division. For instance, you move 5 units, now you move 5 units, now I move another 5 units, and stuff like that. That's what tabletop designers try to do in order to make it more balanced. But in computer, you don't have to do that. You can say, okay, one player will give commands and the other player will simultaneously give commands, and then both of them will press next turn, and then those turns will be executed simultaneously. Computer gives you that ability, and that is beautiful. And that's what this real-time or simultaneous movement gives you, which for me, first of all, is easier because it balances the combat factors, and second of all, it's fair to players not to be able to play with the initiative to destroy 5 units before the other player could destroy his own. This balances the games.
That's fascinating for me, again, coming from a more video game background rather than traditional board game background. I want to ask you, so Brotherhood and Unity was successfully funded on Kickstarter, sold massively well done with that. How was working with Kickstarter like? You have a publisher, Compass Games. Did they handle the campaign, or was it you in collaboration with them? How was that process of like getting Brotherhood and Unity funded on Kickstarter and then actually shipped, because it shipped last year? How was that process?
Well, Compass Games did all that practically. I recorded the Kickstarter video, but they did all the Kickstarter setup and follow-up and support and stuff like that. Kickstarter was only one channel for the PR from many channels. That's their policy. Compass Games has the policy of using all available channels, from 𝐂𝐤𝐴𝐺𝐻 to their web page to their mailing lists and Paper Wars magazine and stuff like that, and Kickstarter, in order to attract as many people as possible. So it wasn't just Kickstarter only game. Kickstarter came in very, very late on, just to get another group of people interested and maybe increase the visibility of the game. So I couldn't really tell you much about Kickstarter because it came really later on. But Compass did a good job with this game. It took a while. It took several years because they have a very big pipeline of around 20-30 games per year, especially those years when I started. And when this COVID situation came in and the game is printed in China, it all just slowed down, because when you make a game in Chinese factory, and they have beautiful machines there that can really make really quality thick cardboard counters, but in order to ship it to the States, it takes half a year or even longer to fill up the ship, and that ship to come to the United States. And then it needs to be repackaged and shipped and stored in a warehouse, and then it needs to be shipped to the consumers all over the world. That's for me, the biggest issue with board games in general, the shipping cost and the warehousing cost. And if you listen to the publishers, especially, for instance, 𝐂𝐸𝐬𝐿 from Academy Games is very well known for commenting on this topic. It's very hard to reach a big enough number of sales to really say, all right, this game was successful. So that's why they use Kickstarter. That's why many games use 3D models, plastic models, because that gives the value to the game. People will pay more, and it will be easier to work with bigger sales than with less sales.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that. Yeah, but then now that you mention it, I can see how these factors could come into play. We are 50 minutes into the podcast, so let's start getting up for the final thoughts segment. You obviously play games, board games, card games, video games in your spare time, as you mentioned. Which games would you recommend to our audience? Not necessarily related to the Bosnian War, but just you've mentioned quite a few. Which games would you recommend?
My couple of favorites and games and the designers, particularly, because what I do, I follow the designers and what they do, and I pick and choose from their games. First and foremost, that would be Mark Herman and his games, one of the greatest designers living today, especially in wargaming world. And his favorite game of mine, and his own too, Empire of the Sun, about the World War II in the Pacific, which is a very fast, very fun game encompassing the whole Pacific War, and it's just a beautiful game. And he did an interesting 3-player game, Churchill, very different and very nuanced combination of diplomacy and politics on one hand, and military actions on the other hand, combined with card play and 3-player mechanics. And then he has Pericles, the Peloponnesian War, which is a single-player game, solitaire game, which is also a beautiful experience. That's Mark Herman for you. Then you have Volko Ruhnke, who is probably the best modern, new age, younger, so to speak, designer, because he launched an entire series of games, so-called counterinsurgency or coin games, which have really now got to, 15 volumes, something like that, encompassing from war in Afghanistan, war in Vietnam, to Cuban Revolution, to even you have Pendragon, which deals with the Romans and Saxons in Old Britain, and you have Gauls and Romans in France and stuff like that. Beautiful game. So Volko Ruhnke and his games must have at least one from the coin series. Then we have Brian Train. For me, is a great designer who is excelling in asymmetrical warfare. For instance, incursions, rebellions, when one side has the government and has the weaponry, and the other side has Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, and bombs, and completely different way of fighting. And his favorite game for me is Colonial Twilight. That is a battle for Algiers between French and the Algerians. And of course, what's the name? A Distant Plain, War in Afghanistan, which he did with the Volko Ruhnke in the coin series. Cole Worley, who was your guest the other day, is a brilliant designer. So if you are not so much into historical heavy-duty wargaming, then I would suggest Cole Worley's games, because he's an intelligent designer and you can really see it in his games. For instance, Pax Pamir is a wonderful game. John Company is such an amazing creation. Then his older, smaller games like An Infamous Traffic, about opium trafficking in China. It's a beautiful small game, and it's going to be reprinted, I think. and John Company is having a reprint
Yeah.
now. So and Root. If you don't have anything else, you should have Root. You can play Root with your children, with your kids, and you're going to have a lot of fun and introduce yourself to wargaming. Root is even available, I think, on Steam.
It is available on, as a tabletop simulator. And for more on 𝐂𝐤𝐬, listen to podcast episode 7. I think that was.
Yeah, definitely 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐬. And I should of course mention Dean Essig, who's I'm very fond of him, especially of lately, because his games on that military level, that operational level of combat, are among the best ones out there. Especially the game about North Africa, Deutsche Afrika Korps, DAC, the second edition, is a beautiful big game. And the beautiful thing about these North African games, they have large maps. Because when you look at the battlefield from El Agheila to Suez Canal, I think it's 1,800 kilometers long. It's a huge battlefield of enormous desert wasteness and nothingness, and armies moving up and down like ships on the sea. So Dean Essig and his games, wonderful stuff. Well, that's about it for now. 4 or 5.
That's 4 or 5 designers who all have quite a few games under their belt. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I want to ask you, what comes next for you then? What are you going to do next, Tom? What other projects can you tell us about it? I know a bunch of these are secret. You know, there are NDAs perhaps. What are you planning next?
I haven't yet decided for sure. I have many ideas written down, and I can talk about them openly. What I'm certain of, I'm going to finish Attack at Dawn North Africa. The biggest challenge now is to make an AI, artificial intelligence, to be as good as possible so that people who played single player can have fun. And I'll continue that series. I continue with that series, and I will probably make some games on the topic of my region in the World War II, Yugoslavia in the World War II, and probably get back to war in Bosnia and Herzegovina with another game, on a couple of games, and war in Croatia possibly, and maybe even Israeli-Arab war. I'll see, but definitely I will make Attack at Dawn North Africa into a series, and these games will come in the periods between.
Oh, wonderful. And Attack at Dawn, when is it set to release? You can wishlist it now on Steam. When do you have a release date?
I don't have a date yet, because the problem with AI design is you never know what you're going to find. You never know. Each time you play a scenario with a different random starting plans, you get a different situation. And if it's not as good as it could be, you need to tweak it. And it takes time, a lot of repetitions until you can say it's all right. And you can't plan it. Many things you can plan, but AI development, as far as I've seen, you really cannot plan. So we'll see. Hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon, yeah. Coming to you. Anyway, everyone, if you wishlist the game on Steam, you can get up to date with all of the
wishlist.
Yeah, absolutely, with all of the updates on the game. Tom, if you had one piece of advice for people like me, younger people wanting to get into game design, what would that advice be?
Couple. First of all, just do it. Don't think much about it. Just start doing it. Draw, do computer, whichever tool you choose. Second of all, don't reinvent the wheel. Look at the other games, look at the existing mechanics and copy them as much as you can and fit them into your design. And third of all, just don't be afraid. Just experiment and research. Do the research and play and have fun. Most of all, have fun. If you have fun, then you have a good game.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's sound advice. Thank you everyone for listening to the podcast, or watching the podcast if you happen to be on YouTube. In terms of what's happening from the History and Games Lab, we are a bit hibernating in terms of like our activities. We have a social, which at the time of this recording is going to happen this upcoming Wednesday. But other than that, no planned events for the month of July, as we all kind of relax in the sun as it's actually getting warmer in Scotland as well. So, but regardless, stay up to date with what we have planned for perhaps further on in August, and especially in September, when it has been confirmed that we will have a presence at the Freshers Fair. So if you're willing to engage with a lab in a very tactile, physical way that we mentioned earlier, like with board games, like with games, please do that then. If you have any feedback or would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance, our DMs are open on Twitter at @HNGLab, or you can email us at hnglabpodcast@gmail.com. For more on the History and Games Lab, please access our Linktree link, which is also available for you to see on screen if you happen to be on YouTube, or which will be in the description. That's where you'll find our Twitter, our Facebook, our Instagram, everywhere we are on the internet. Tom, where could our listeners find more about you? Where can we go to seek out more information from you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, I'm everywhere. I'm everywhere, but maybe the best way is to go to website www.attackaatdawn.com, or for instance, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is called Attack at Dawn North Africa, or you can subscribe to my Twitter account, which is Attack at Dawn North Africa or Panzer Division Games, or on Facebook you have Attack at Dawn North Africa. So we have Facebook, Twitter, webpage, and YouTube. So that pretty much covers most of those channels.
Perfect. And again, for everyone interested, I have the links in the show notes, in the description, whether you're listening on podcast services, whether you're watching this on YouTube, just to find all of the links to everything that we've mentioned in the description/show notes. Tom, the last word, what would you like to emphasize? If there's one thing that you'd like for our listeners and viewers to take back from this podcast, what's that one thing that you like for everyone to remember?
Play historical war games. At start, it's a bit hard to learn the rules, but when you get a grip of it, you'll find a beautiful world of knowledge and fun.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining me, and thank you so much to you for listening and watching this podcast. Until next time, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.
The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab, which should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.